The Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. I'd like to say good morning to everyone. I would like to start this hearing by thanking you, Administrator Criswell, and the FEMA workforce for all that you do to fulfill your mission of helping people before, during, and after disasters. We are here to discuss FEMA's budget requests for fiscal year 2023, management of recent disasters, and preparedness for future ones. The threat of climate change continues to grow due to increasing temperatures. It appears record-breaking weather is our new reality. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has predicted another above-average hurricane season. In 2021, there were 58 major disaster declarations. This year, we have already had 20 major disaster declarations. In 2017, Hurricane Irma caused 84 deaths in my home state of Florida and nearly $50 billion in damages for the United States. In 2020, Hurricane Sally severely impacted Florida and resulted in $7.3 billion in damages across the Florida Panhandle and Alabama. In 2022 alone, the Florida Forest Service has reported that 37 wildfires have destroyed over 22,000 acres in the state. And this year, FEMA's preparedness efforts could very well be impacted by supply chain shortages. In Florida, we have real concerns about the critical labor and supply chain shortages that are impacting Florida's electric cooperatives and municipalities. These issues highlight the importance of preparedness for disasters at all levels and certainly creates additional challenges for FEMA's workforce. This subcommittee, without a doubt, recognizes the overwhelming responsibilities placed on FEMA and have held 2 hearings this year on FEMA's workforce. FEMA's workforce has experienced several challenges related to recruitment, retention, and training, for example. I understand that FEMA is working to address these challenges, and I look forward to hearing more today about how the agency is working to help this incredible workforce thrive. Investing in FEMA's workforce ensures that they will continue to be prepared to tackle crises as they emerge. The agency's fiscal year 2023 budget request contains several initiatives to help support and strengthen FEMA's workforce, including $6.4 million for the incident management workforce. FEMA administers preparedness grants to states and locals, such as the Urban Area Security Initiative, URASI, and the State Homeland Security Program. These funds assist states and local jurisdictions with building and maintaining homeland security capabilities to prepare for and respond to threats. As a former law enforcement executive, I have seen the benefits of URASI in Orlando and other jurisdictions. When I was a police chief, I relied on the URASI program to help keep my community safe. Last year, I introduced H.R. 5115, the Homeland Security's Capabilities Preservation Act, which recognizes the importance of preserving security capabilities achieved with URASI funding for communities. I am pleased the legislation passed the House in March. I am confident that this subcommittee will continue to do our part and push for this legislation to become law. As an advocate for the URASI program, I am concerned about the agency's budget request for fiscal year 2023, which proposes cuts to the Urban Area Security Initiative and the State Homeland Security Program. I look forward to our conversation today about these vital programs. I am pleased, though, to see that the proposed budget request includes $360 million for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which is $110 million above fiscal year 2022 funding. The proposed funding increase is especially important in recent years because we have seen a spat of threats against nonprofits, specifically houses of worship, and including 36 bomb threats to historically Black colleges and universities alone. This year, we have seen the value of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. For example, Rabbi Citron Walker recalled training funded by the program helped him and congregants escape an armed individual who was holding them hostage at a congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. Furthermore, I am a proud sponsor of Chairman Thompson's legislation, H.R. 7668, the Federal Emergency Management Advancement of Equity Act, which is a tremendous step in making certain the disaster response more adequately meets the needs in the most vulnerable areas throughout our nation. I look forward to hearing from you, Administrator Criswell, about how the proposed budget helps bolster FEMA's readiness to tackle the ever-growing threats and how Congress can continue to assist in supporting your mission. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery Subcommittee, the gentlewoman of Florida, Ms. Kamek, for her opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Demings, for holding this important hearing today. Thank you to Administrator Criswell for being here before us. And as Floridians, of course, I think there's far more that we agree on when it comes to this issue than most others. So I'm excited for today's hearing. And as we all know, FEMA's mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. And I put an emphasis on before because I think collectively when we place an emphasis on mitigation, we are better for it in the aftermath. With the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season entering its second week, this mission cannot be overstated. As representatives from Florida, I know that the chairwoman and I both agree that our state certainly has seen its fair share of natural disasters. And during my time as the ranking member of this subcommittee, I have gained a deeper appreciation for the vital work that FEMA does and for the men and women that comprise FEMA's workforce. I've also seen firsthand the incredible amount of work that we have ahead of us, but I feel confident that we will succeed. For example, the suite of preparedness grants administered by FEMA provides critical support so that state, local, tribal, and territorial governments have the resources necessary to keep our communities safe. Following the horrific attack against the congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, I was pleased to see the increase to the Nonprofit Security Grant Program to $360 million for fiscal year 23. Similarly, I was very pleased to see an increase of $10 million in the FY23 request from the FY22 enacted levels for both the Assistance to Firefighters Grant Program and the Staffing for Adequate Fire and Emergency Response, the SAFER grant programs. Now, as the wife of a proud wife of a firefighter, I know how important and necessary these grants are, not only for our professional and career departments, but for our nearly 30,000 volunteer fire departments across the United States. And sometimes I feel like they're a little bit of the red-headed stepchild, and they don't get near enough attention. So today I'm going to be talking about their needs as well and how FEMA can better serve our volunteer departments. The FY23 budget request also includes $312 million for education training and exercises, including $8 million for FEMA's Emergency Management Institute to expand satellite partnerships, develop leadership programs, and modernize virtual technology systems, among other items. It is important that through EMI and FEMA's other educational facilities that we ensure resources and training remain accessible to communities across the country, including our rural communities. I look forward to hearing more from the administrator on EMI's requests and additional initiatives that seek to improve the invaluable training for our nation's emergency responders. Additionally, while not explicitly laid out in the budget, I am encouraged to learn of FEMA's recently released building code strategy, which seeks to organize and prioritize FEMA's activities to advance the adoption and enforcement of hazard-resistant building codes and standards for FEMA programs. As we learned from University of Florida professor Dr. David Pravat, go Gators, who submitted written testimony for our last subcommittee hearing, our better building construction can narrow the width of the most catastrophic destruction so that homes, while possibly experiencing damage, can remain habitable immediately following a disaster. Not only does better building construction immensely benefit the disaster survivor, but there is potential for significant cost savings. While much of FEMA's FY23 budget seems fairly straightforward, I still have major concerns regarding FEMA's emergency food and shelter program. The 23 request includes $24 million to provide shelter and other services to families and individuals encountered by the Department of Homeland Security. Now, although $24 million is less than the $150 million enacted for fiscal year 2022, it is not an insignificant number. And at a time when Americans are having to make the choice between gas or groceries, and those on fixed incomes are seeing their rents skyrocket, I have to ask why so much of American tax dollars are going to house illegal immigrants. I would also like this time to mention my concerns with FEMA's funeral assistance program. During a full committee hearing last year, I asked you, Administrator Criswell, if there were enough safeguards in place to ensure that fraud throughout the program would not be rampant. During that hearing, you assured me that FEMA was taking the necessary precautions. However, both the DHS Office of Inspector General and the GAO recently released reports detailing instances of fraud within the program that, of course, has led to abuse and waste of taxpayer dollars. Given that this program has paid out over $2.5 billion with a B, I look forward to hearing more on the program today and the steps that you and FEMA are taking to ensure that these issues are corrected. Again, I want to thank you, Administrator Criswell, for appearing before us today, and I'm eager to learn of FEMA's priorities for the coming year and how this budget request supports our goals. I know that we have sparred a bit over these last 16 months over various issues, but I want to assure you and my colleagues and Americans that we are here and we have to ask the tough questions and conduct the actual oversight if we are going to be effective in FEMA's mission. And as always, thank you to our FEMA workforce, our first responders, our emergency managers, and community partners at every level of government. Your ability to adapt to ever-changing threats and vulnerabilities ensures that our nation's continued ability to prevent, prepare, and mitigate, respond to, and recover from the threats and hazards we face daily. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
I want to thank the ranking member for her opening statement, and as I think about the safety and security of the people that we represent, I don't believe there are any tough questions that we are not prepared for or laser focused on providing the necessary services. So thank you for your opening statement. Members are reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd, 2021 colloquy regarding remote procedures. Without objections, members not on the subcommittee shall be permitted to sit and question the witnesses. I welcome our witness, Diane Criswell, the administrator for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Ms. Criswell is the 12th administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and is the first Senate-confirmed woman to lead the agency. Prior to her appointment, Administrator Criswell was the commissioner for the New York Emergency Management Department, where she coordinated emergency planning and response for all emergencies, including COVID-19. Previously, Administrator Criswell worked for FEMA as a federal coordinating officer, where she was the primary federal representative responsible for leading the agency's response during declared disasters. Without objection, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I now ask Administrator Criswell to summarize her statement for 5 minutes. Good morning.
Good morning, Chairwoman Demings, Ranking Member Kamek, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for inviting me here today to talk about our fiscal year 2023 budget request. As you have mentioned in your statements, the field of emergency management is at a pivotal moment in its history. While our mission itself has not changed, our operating environment has. 10 years ago, we managed an average of 108 disasters a year. Today, as of June 10th, we are managing 348. This includes the ongoing response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The changing climate is the biggest crisis facing our nation and makes natural disasters more frequent and more destructive. At the same time, structural inequities in our society are compounding the impacts of disasters for underserved communities. And our budget request for FEMA ensures that the agency can meet these challenges and continue to help people before, during, and after disasters. FEMA aligned its budget request to support the 3 goals in our strategic plan. First, as an agency, we must instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. We must recognize that disasters affect individuals and communities differently. Our strategic plan focuses our entire agency on putting people first and reducing barriers to our programs. We have already made important changes in how we provide assistance. For instance, some homeowners had difficulty proving that they own their homes, and if their property had been handed down through the generations. We expanded the types of documentation that we can accept, including receipts for major repairs or improvements, court documents, public officials' letters, and even applicant self-certification for mobile homes and travel trailers as a last resort. In addition, we changed the way that we calculate the threshold for property losses to qualify for our direct housing program. This resulted in more than 2,700 families receiving assistance who would not have been considered for direct housing in the past. That means over 2,700 families with a roof over their head, a bed to sleep in, and a stove to cook with. We also know the more our workforce resembles the nation we serve, the better that we will serve it. We are adapting our recruiting efforts to reach individuals from underrepresented communities by partnering with organizations like historically Black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions. Second, we must lead the whole community in climate resilience. FEMA is not just a response and recovery agency. One of my highest priorities is hazard mitigation. Congress's investment in hazard mitigation has been strong. We've seen it most recently through the appropriation of $6.8 billion in mitigation funds to FEMA in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in 2021, including funding to establish revolving loan funds under the STORM Act. The budget request includes $3.4 billion for further investments, including the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, our Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, flood maps, and the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard. We think innovatively and shift our projects to those with community-wide impact. And we must eliminate the barriers underserved communities face when seeking hazard mitigation assistance. Third, we must promote and sustain a ready FEMA and a prepared nation. The increased frequency, severity, and complexity of disasters has heightened demands on FEMA's workforce and on the broader emergency management community. FEMA's request includes $19.7 billion for the Disaster Relief Fund to address current and future disasters. To reach this number, FEMA worked shoulder to shoulder with disaster-impacted states and localities to understand their recovery needs from ongoing catastrophic disasters, in addition to evaluating the historical cost average for non-catastrophic disasters, the allocation of funds for BRIC, and a reserve to ensure FEMA maintains the ability to fund initial response operations for new significant events. While natural disasters are at the forefront of our discussions today, we cannot overlook our threats facing our nation, which FEMA has been charged with helping to mitigate. Like natural disasters, terrorist attacks can occur at any time, anywhere. We saw this earlier this year during a hostage standoff at the Congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. I visited this synagogue and spoke to the rabbi following the attack, and he relayed to me, as you mentioned, Chairwoman, of the importance of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program and how it helped to save lives. We are requesting $360 million for this program to continue this effort. The unrelenting pace of a year-round disaster cycle and crises places great demands on our FEMA workforce. We must look out for the physical, the emotional, and the mental health of our workforce. Their adaptability, their dedication, and willingness to do the hard work is extraordinary. And I believe that the President's budget request will enable them to continue to do their incredible work. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
I want to thank Administrator Deanne Criswell for your testimony. I will remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witness. I will now recognize myself for questions. Administrator, no one knows better than you here today that 2 weeks ago marked the beginning of the hurricane season. You also pointed out a decade ago we had roughly 108 disasters. Now we're looking at 348 roughly. Things have definitely changed and increased. But when we think about the challenges that we now face, is the FEMA workforce prepared for what is predicted to be an above-average hurricane season?
Chairwoman Demings, I do believe that our workforce is prepared. We have one of the most dedicated workforces that I think you can find anywhere in the federal government, and they are committed to our mission of helping people before, during, and after disasters. While we have seen the increase in the number of disasters, our team continues to look at ways that we can staff these events and not have an added strain on our members. We are taking a look right now at taking a step back at, now that we have more of this year-long operational tempo instead of the peak that we have traditionally seen during hurricane season, of what does the future staffing model need to look like. We're doing a deep dive into that analysis so we can better plan and appropriate our staff for a year-long response as we continue to go forward.
One of the top issues that we're dealing with, certainly here in the U.S., but around the world, centers around supply chain shortages. How are you working with local government and the private sector to employ supply chain mitigation efforts in advance of disaster striking?
We are very concerned, as the rest of Americans are, on the impacts that the supply chain is having across the nation. But we have built a stockpile of our response requirements at our distribution centers across the nation. So I feel confident that the stockpile of equipment and supplies that we have will meet the needs for any disaster response that we have going into this hurricane season. But through our regional administrators, they are the belly button that are working with our state and local officials, state and local emergency managers to understand what their gaps are. And it's through those ongoing conversations that our regional administrators have a better understanding of where their needs might be, and then we can be better prepared to support them if we need to come in and help after a disaster.
How have you been able to coordinate with the private sector?
We have a private sector office at FEMA that works continuously across the different industries to better understand where they are at and what their needs are going to be. We have also initiated an analysis of what the potential supply chain impacts will be for this hurricane season through one of our contracts, and we expect the results of that sometime in the next few weeks.
Thank you. As a former law enforcement professional, I've already indicated the importance of grant programs like URASI and how beneficial they are to local and state government in terms of preparing for threats of any kind. I was certainly disappointed to hear about the cut in funding for this particular program, knowing that law enforcement is, as you well know, on the front line. Could you talk about, based on your experience, how you believe local jurisdictions will be impacted by the reduced funding?
There is no doubt that our Homeland Security suite of programs that we have has increased the capacity for local jurisdictions across this country, whether it's our UASI programs or our state Homeland Security programs or nonprofit security grant programs. As we have seen the capacity in primarily our UASI program and our Homeland Security program increase the capabilities across the nation, we also recognize that there is a need to increase capacity in other areas. That's one of the reasons that we have asked for the increase in our nonprofit security grant program. But to get specifically to your question, I would say one of the biggest things that we have also been asking our local jurisdictions to spend their UASC money on is cyber preparedness. And we have an additional grant program that will be coming out as we partner with CISA that is focused specifically on cyber preparedness. And so now we no longer are going to require our local jurisdictions to have a maximum or mandatory spend on cyber because they'll have this additional program. They can use that funding for their other capacity-related needs.
Thank you, Administrator Criswell. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Demings. Thank you again, Administrator Criswell. Before we get into questions, I know you and I, as well as our respective teams, have chatted at length about outstanding project worksheets from previous storms and events. And so I would like to submit for the record a list of outstanding project worksheets from various congressional offices for the record, but also, and I'd like to get your commitment to responding with a status
Without
update.
objection.
Thank you. Within 30 days?
And you have my commitment to respond within 30 days.
Thank you so much. So I alluded to my concerns in my opening statement about this administration's prioritization of illegals at the border over American citizens, particularly as we're facing record inflation. So in FY21, there were 1.7 million illegals encountered at the southwest border, and FEMA actually spent $150 million in response to this crisis, using $150 million for housing and food. Now, fast forward to April of this year, 2022, there were 234,000 migrant encounters along the southwest border, which is the highest number of monthly encounters in the last 2 decades. Now, this year's budget request, fiscal year 23, includes $24 million for FEMA's Emergency Food and Shelter Program for the purpose of providing shelter and other services to families and individuals encountered by the DHS at the southwest border. The President's FY23 budget request states that, quote, communities are providing food, shelter, transportation, COVID-19 testing, and care associated with recommended quarantining and isolation of this population and incurring the cost of this relief. The use of hotels and non-congregate space remains as a prevalent solution and will remain for the foreseeable future, even if COVID-19 concerns decrease. So I find it very troubling that in the budget request specifically mentions increased costs associated with COVID-19 precautions, yet there is still consideration from the administration to lift Title 42, which of course, as we know, is a CDC directive. Do you anticipate additional migrant encounters along the southwest border? And if so, will FEMA be requesting additional funds through the Emergency Food and Shelter Program to address the crisis at the border?
Ranking Member Kamek, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program has been a great tool to support the humanitarian needs at the border. It is a program that is funded by FEMA but run through a board of directors of nonprofit organizations. And the things that you mentioned, such as transportation, sheltering food, are eligible expenses by these nonprofit agencies to be able to fund the needs that they're encountering. I do not know what the potential increase in the number of border encounters is going to be, as I am not an immigration agency, but we'll work closely with the Secretary and his staff as we monitor what the border is needing, and if we need to make a request, we would certainly consult with the Secretary on other options.
Well, and my apologies for interrupting, but the Secretary, DHS, the agency, has stated that Title 42 being lifted would result in 18,000 encounters a day. Is FEMA prepared to handle that volume with a request of $24 million?
FEMA's role as it relates to the border is really a coordinating role. We have staff that are assigned to the Southern Border Coordination Center, which is located at CBP headquarters. Our role will continue to be a coordinating role, and we'll continue to provide funding to the nonprofit agencies through the Emergency Food and Shelter Program.
Well, and considering that the Emergency Food and Shelter Program has a board that administers these funds, it's comprised of several of the charities that actually themselves receive the funds. So how do we ensure accountability, and what oversight role is of this board that is doling out millions and millions of dollars of taxpayer funds?
Yeah, it's a great question, Congresswoman, and we have a couple of mechanisms in place to ensure that the funding is being spent appropriately. First, there are the local boards for the charities that look at every expenditure to make sure that it's a valid expenditure. Then our national board also looks at all of the expenditures to make sure that they are authorized expenditures. And then we conduct through FEMA and one of our contractors an annual audit of the program to ensure that we're using the funding as the way it was intended.
Would you agree that since FEMA is administering a program at the border, that the border is in fact a crisis?
I would say that the work that we are doing to help coordinate the migrant crossings is in support of our partners at CBP and ICE.
And I'm out of time, but for the record, I have a list of questions that I will submit if the chairwoman would be so kind, and I would appreciate a timely response, Administrator Criswell.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time has expired. This time, the chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes. Ms. Jackson Lee, can you hear us? Ms. Jackson Lee, it looks like you're on mute. We will come back to her. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Chair, did you yield to me?
Mr. Green? Ms. Jackson Lee, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so very much. From the signing, thank you, Madam Chair, for this, and the ranking member for this very important hearing and your leadership. This is an area that I have been engaged in, I guess by necessity, coming from hurricane country. And I have been a veteran of any number of hurricanes. Notoriety is well known in America, from Katrina to a storm called Storm Alicia that literally obliterated major research in the Texas Medical Center, to Hurricane Ike that drove us to the level of knowing that we needed a coastal spine, and of course Hurricane Harvey that magnified the disaster of what can happen to people, loss of life, loss of property. So I want to at first thank the administrator for the continued service of her team and the work in particular of Region 6 that I have worked with over the many, many years. But to emphasize that this organization, I think signed into law in 1979, has not gotten the importance, focus. And we thank President Biden administration for recognizing increased budget for FEMA. And so I want to focus on some of the issues. And to the chairwoman, I particularly want to focus on the ailments of the Stafford Act. This is law, but it poses a great hindrance when the impacted areas of a state have to be totally dependent upon a governor's late recognition that an area should be declared a disaster. Administrator, what is the time frame which you can stand up your operation from the moment of a area being called a national disaster?
Congresswoman Jackson Lee, thank you for the question. Our role has really been, over the last several years, to lean forward as we have these notice events. As you in Texas, as we're seeing in the Gulf Coast states along the East Coast, when we know that there's a hurricane coming, we are going to deploy resources ahead of time so they can be pre-positioned to support the state and the local jurisdictions as soon as it is safe to do so. Once there is a presidential disaster declaration, that means that they are already in place for us to be able to go in and start providing assistance. But we will also be able to provide assistance under our surge fund before we get the final paperwork if needed. We've also really been working last year with our governors to encourage them to ask for pre-landfall disaster declarations. So if you see a hurricane coming, we want you to ask for this pre-landfall emergency declaration so that way we can start moving those resources in and employing them ahead of time. Something that we're actually encouraging governors to do as we can see these events approaching them. So we don't have hesitation, we can support immediately.
But you have to wait upon the declaration, is that correct?
We can deploy resources into the area without
But you
waiting, and
cannot
we can
utilize
use
them.
our surge fund to employ some resources before a declaration.
But the issue is that the process of assessing the declaration or by the governor sometimes holds up local communities. I just want to put that on the record. And I believe that the Stafford Act should be modified to allow local communities that are devastated, particularly maybe large urban and large rural areas, to be able to activate the resources that FEMA has. Let me move quickly to the idea of staffing, and I heard you indicate your faith in your staff, and I certainly have confidence in them. But what are the real needs of FEMA? Is there a move, or should there be a move to ensuring more permanent staff to be able to assist in having staff ready for these disasters that seem to be year round? It's not necessarily hurricanes, but other forms of natural disasters.
I would say that the one thing that is going to really make a difference in our ability to staff disasters right now is a bill that's being looked at in the Senate and in Congress. And I think Chairwoman Demings, you have been a co-sponsor of this bill as well as Congressman Katko, and that's the CREW Act. And that is going to give our reservist workforce, which is the heartbeat of what we do for disasters. It is the majority of our staff that surge in when an incident happens to support those local communities. What this act will do is give them USERRA protection, so reemployment protection, which means it'll transform the way that we can recruit our reservist workforce, bring in specialties to come in and support those jurisdictions, even give us the opportunity to have more reservists that are right in the local community.
I'll submit my other questions for the record. I appreciate the administrator. I do want to find out about the decrease in the state Homeland Security grant program that has been proposed, and would like to help to ensure those funds get reinstated. But thank you, Administrator, for your service, and thank you to the FEMA team, and thank you, Madam Chair, for yielding.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank Administrator Criswell for being with us today. Ensuring a sustainable and effective FEMA budget is critical for the nation, so I appreciate Administrator Criswell making time today to visit with the subcommittee. I'm also appreciative of the open lines of communication with Administrator Criswell and her office. I'm thankful for her candor and the willingness to help. We have spoken on many occasions, and the administrator and her staff have never failed to rise to the challenges that we face together. Recovery after a disaster is far from a straightforward process. As a congressman who represents a region that's quite accustomed to the impact of powerful hurricanes, I've survived many in the course of my life. But 2 years ago was a particularly brutal, devastating storm season for South Louisiana. So I can personally attest to the frustration many of my constituents face after a disaster. And I must say for the record, Madam Chair, that I am uplifted by the level of commitment that my office has received, both officially and through direct communications from Administrator Criswell and her office. If we intend to ensure that recovery efforts are resilient and America's treasure is wisely spent, in timely communication and simplifying the necessary documents and procedures between FEMA and the state and local agencies is imperative. We must streamline the process. That's why I'm thankful to see FEMA request $51.1 million for grant management modernization practices at the agency and $19.7 billion for the Disaster Relief Fund. These investments could potentially better serve the communities across the country when a disaster strikes. Administrator Criswell, regarding the modernization endeavor, would you share with us a little bit how that will work? How will that better serve communities attempting to recover from a disaster?
Congressman Higgins, we are so reliant right now on our IT infrastructure in order to better support communities after disaster. It has been an amazing resource as we continue to work to improve the way we're delivering services, that we can actually get funding out into the hands of survivors so much quicker. And that includes then our grant modernization process as well. So when we're talking about after disaster, we've made a lot of improvements, but we also need to make sure that the access to the work that we do before a disaster through our grant programs is also easier for our customers to be able to navigate. The funding that we're going to put in to continue to modernize our grant modernization program is building on what we have already started with our BRIC programs, our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community, and some other hazard mitigation programs, move that into even our recovery programs, our recovery grant programs, so we can better use the data that our customers are giving us at a single instance, and so we don't continually ask them for the same information over and over. I think as we continue this modernization, it's just going to make it, again, easier, removing barriers from our customers so they can access the resources that they are eligible for.
Well, that would be our shared intention, be to simplify and streamline the process. I'd like to thank you again for taking time last week to discuss the issues facing a couple of my parishes, Calcasieu and Cameron Parish School Boards, as well as the Lake Charles Housing Authority. My office will continue to work closely with you and your staff, ma'am. And I have received your pledge for continued attention to the matter. I hope you can support that pledge here today with my colleagues.
Congressman Higgins, I really appreciated the phone call that we had last Friday, and I do continue to commit to working with you, providing you an update next week, as we discussed last week, on our progress towards the issues that you identified.
Yes, ma'am. We look forward to working very hard together with you and your staff in order to seek final resolution and recovery for so many scores of thousands of South Louisiana citizens that continue to suffer from the brutal storms of 2020. Madam Chair, my time has expired, and I yield.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you ever so much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this is an exceedingly important hearing for a multiplicity of reasons, especially associated with Houston, Texas. So I thank you. I'd also like to thank the staff. Ordinarily, I draft my own questions, but the staff has done an outstanding job with a couple of questions, and I want to commend them. They are capable, competent, and qualified, and they always come through for us when we ask them to. So thank you, staff. Madam Chair, Houston had about 1 trillion gallons of water. It was inundated as a result of Hurricane Harvey. And after that, we sought help through the GLO after the federal government sent funds to the GLO to disperse and help the people who were the victims of Hurricane Harvey. Well, as fate would have it, the GLO decided that Houston should get $0 initially, as well as Harris County, which is the county Houston is located in. Then there was some talk, and the GLO decided that, well, Harris County can receive some help, but Houston is still receiving $0. And the monies that would come to Houston, the area that was most devastated, which was the epicenter, will eventually go to other areas where we have persons who were not harmed by Harvey to some extent, and maybe some to a very some extent that's much less than those in Houston. So my question to the chair is, pardon me, to the, let me make sure I got your title right. Okay, Ms. Criswell, my question to you is how can FEMA help us to ensure that we get equity when soliciting these funds? And how can you solicit funds and disperse funds to FEMA, GLO, such that it would treat cities like Houston fairly?
Congressman Green, mitigation is one of my top priorities, right? And we need to be able to take a lot of the efforts that FEMA is doing and work towards what we can do to prevent or reduce the impacts that we're seeing from these natural disasters. And I am aware and appreciate the struggles that Harris County and Houston is facing with their increased flooding. We do have a number of programs. The one that you are mentioning is our Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is a post-disaster program, and it is administered through the state. It is a pass-through through the state, which would mean it would go through GLO in your case. But we also have pre-disaster mitigation funding, like our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program and our flood mitigation assistance, which you can apply directly to FEMA. And I'd be happy to have my regional office get in touch with your staff to talk about ways that we can make sure that they're taking advantage of these pre-disaster programs as well.
I would greatly appreciate it. Can that happen rather quickly, because there are other things that are happening with reference to GLO, and this can have an impact. So how will we perfect this? Will someone contact my staff today? If so, I'll give you the proper person to contact.
Yeah, my staff will follow up with your team immediately following this hearing, and we'll be able to make those connections. I will just acknowledge that hazard mitigation programs are usually complicated programs that do take time, and so these programs aren't projects that can be put in place quickly.
I understand. Well, my chief of staff is Nihar Razi, and would greatly appreciate it if you would make an effort to contact her. Let me quickly move on, Administrator, and my apologies for my earlier faux pas. I'm sorry about that, but 18% of the unhoused community in Houston said that they were homeless. Homelessness is a real problem. And I have worked with people. I'm a hands-on congressperson, as is the case with many of my colleagues. And I've worked with homeless people. And I know the difficulty they have when we have these natural disasters. So my question to you is simply this: those who are experiencing homelessness, what can we do to assure that they will get the proper assistance that they merit when we have these catastrophes?
Homelessness is certainly an issue that is increasing across our nation, and it's compounded even more for those individuals after a natural disaster. Again, I would offer the assistance of my regional administrator and our team to work with communities to help them with their preparedness plans. And individuals are always eligible to request assistance and register for assistance through FEMA once a natural disaster has been declared by the president. And then they are eligible for some resources in our individual assistance programs.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to hearing from your team. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the ranking member for holding this hearing, and thank you to the administrator for being here. Ms. Criswell, I have just a few questions. This year, I led the fiscal year 23 New York bipartisan delegation letter to the Appropriations Committee requesting robust funding for FEMA, state and local grants to provide much needed resilience funding to mitigate man-made and natural risks. You've talked a lot about these grants already today. Last month, this subcommittee heard from the Major Cities Chiefs Association with concerns that these preparedness grants do not appropriately solicit law enforcement input given their role in implementing such grants in their respective cities. As Congress continues to provide robust funding to FEMA for these preparedness grants, how do you plan to ensure that FEMA is appropriately soliciting law enforcement input to ensure the safety of New Yorkers and all Americans?
Congressman, our preparedness grants, as I mentioned earlier, have been such an instrumental part in increasing our capacity across the country. And law enforcement is a big piece of that. They are definitely a partner in our ability to be able to increase capacity to prevent terrorist attacks. We do extensive outreach and engagement to include law enforcement communities, but I'd be happy to get with your staff to find out if there's an area that we are missing so we can continue to work on making sure we have all the appropriate stakeholders at the table. I would also point out, though, this year as well in our Urban Area Security Initiative and our Homeland Security grants that we actually increased the amount of funding that is to be spent on law enforcement. I don't remember the exact percentage off the top of my head, but recognizing the importance that our law enforcement community places or has the role they have in our ability to be prepared, we've increased that amount of funding to be spent on their ability to increase their capacity.
No, and we appreciate that increase. I think that's great, but just maybe there's just the communication between, and I'm just bringing up a problem that the Major Cities Chiefs Association brought up to us, that there doesn't seem to be communication between FEMA or enough communication between FEMA and law enforcement when they're determining this grant. So I appreciate the increase in funding. I think that's great, but we can facilitate through my office also if you'd like to do that. But just having some more communication, I think, is what they would like to see. On a second note, and I know you talked about a couple of people have already asked about the state and local cybersecurity grant programs. Last we spoke to CISA. They had told us that they thought the grant program was going to be up and running late spring, early summer. We're now in early summer. Can you provide an update on the timeline? And if you already answered this question, I apologize, but what's the timeline for the rollout here?
I don't have the exact timeline in front of me, Congressman, but I know that we are working closely with CISA to develop the Notice of Funding Opportunity. The last update I received is that Notice of Funding Opportunity is going to come out sometime this summer. But I'll certainly follow up with my team in their conversations with CISA, and we'll get back to your staff.
So I just want to, FEMA is running, or CISA is doing the technological part of this, right? And FEMA is overseeing it. What's FEMA's role in the grant program?
Yeah, absolutely. So FEMA is the fiduciary agent. We will administer the grant on behalf of CISA, but they set all of the requirements. They are the subject matter experts. They will define the parameters in which individuals or organizations can request assistance, and then they will review the grant applications to make allocation determinations. So,
and this is a huge issue. It's a huge grant program. We're very excited about it. The money needs to get out the door because cybersecurity waits for no one. So is FEMA ready today to do what it needs to do? Is it just waiting for CISA to finish setting up the program, or what's the delay? Because like I said, last we heard it was late spring, early summer. We're in early summer.
Yeah, Congressman, I hadn't heard that timeline, so I don't know specifically what the delay will be. Again, we are working really closely with CISA. This is a brand new grant program, and we want to make sure that we get the requirements right so we can reach out to those organizations that are going to benefit the most from this new grant program.
But your working relationship with CISA right now, it's good. There's no hiccups there.
Not that I am aware of.
All right. Thank you, Administrator. My time is out. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes a gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Chairwoman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. And Madam Administrator, thank you for the information you're sharing. I represent the 12th Congressional District, which includes the capital city of that state. And that's Trenton. My understanding is that ABC News reported that residents of Trenton, New Jersey are still waiting for assistance from FEMA after Hurricane Ida. It's been a long 9 months for those in need of assistance, and they are still waiting for support. Can you speak to why there have been delays in assistance to residents of Trenton? And can I have your commitment that you will work to resolve this 9-month-long waiting period for FEMA assistance?
Congressman Watson Coleman, I don't have the specifics of the institutions that you're talking about. I am certainly happy to get with my team after this. and get more detail from your staff, and then we can get you a more informed answer.
All right, we certainly will follow up because this is very urgent, and we all know the population that is in greatest need in the city of Trenton is a population that tends to get underserved because of its socioeconomic status. Madam Administrator, severe weather is becoming our new normal in the face of climate change, and heat waves in particular cause more death annually in the United States than any other severe weather event. FEMA has historically devoted very few resources to address extreme heat. And given that last year, 80% of Americans experienced a heat wave, last week I introduced the State Pool Act, HR 7949, to study, mitigate, and address the impacts of extreme heat. What actions, if any, is FEMA taking to address and mitigate the growing threat of extreme heat?
Congresswoman, we are very concerned about extreme heat and the heat that we're continuing to see be exacerbated by climate change. And we know that as these heat domes continue to rise, the fatalities are going to continue to rise, and there are more fatalities every year from heat than any other natural disaster. And we also see secondary fatalities after disaster as a result of the heat. We monitor the heat conditions very closely. We work very closely with our partners at the National Weather Service and coordinate with our regional and state partners to help with their preparedness plans. We will continue to work with them to help them better understand what their risk is for heat. We actually have a resilience analysis and planning tool that helps communities identify their vulnerable populations, and they can use this information to put better plans in place to support those populations if they're going to experience a heat emergency.
All right, given the fact that we kind of agree that because of climate change, we're going to be experiencing so much more of this extreme heat, and the fact that just recently predicted there was going to be this heat emergency that we're going to experience this summer. Is there anything specific in terms of resources and timeframes that FEMA could report to us that it's doing, recognizing that it's become a real crisis situation here?
I think if you're asking about resources in the terms of data, we're happy to work through some analysis and some data to better understand the increasing threat that we're experiencing. We also can work with our local communities to help them access information on ready.gov that helps them, again, put some plans in place to support these heat-related events. I think the biggest thing that we as a nation in an emergency management community need to do is understand the threats that we're going to face in the next 5 and 10 years. Heat is certainly one of them, and working together now to build preparedness plans on how we're going to respond.
Thank you. I have two quick questions I'm going to ask them. They're totally at different ends of the spectrum. Number one is I'm still concerned about the ability to create an inclusive, diverse environment in leadership as well as in employees. I want to know what FEMA is doing with regard to that. And lastly, I want to know, are nonprofit clinics that are healthcare related and that also perform, make available pregnancy terminations, are they eligible under the programs that you identified?
Congresswoman, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say pregnancy determinations?
Terminations. Abortions.
I'm still not understanding the word.
I want to know if the nonprofit organizations that provide health care, in addition, they provide abortion to people, are they eligible for the grant program for safety and security that you mentioned earlier?
So certain nonprofit agencies, organizations are eligible for reimbursement after disaster. They have to meet certain criteria as far as a certified 501c3. We would have to see the specifics on each individual organization to see if they meet our criteria as defined in the Stafford Act for a nonprofit organization.
Well, I'm sorry, I was really interested in the nonprofit security grants. I don't think that they're predicated upon a response to a disaster. They're kind of a protective in nature. And I just wanted to know if these
Yeah,
entities were eligible. If that's a yes or no.
they
The
would have
the
to meet the same
gentlewoman's time has
criteria.
expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Yeah, they would have the
Thank you,
same
Madam Chair.
qualification requirements to meet in the Stafford Act on what qualifies as a nonprofit organization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator Criswell, you were the Commissioner for Emergency Management in New York, and I was a New York City Council member
Yes.
during the peak of the pandemic. So I have a few questions about COVID. George Kennan once described the First World War as the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. And those words come to mind when I think of COVID-19, which has become the seminal catastrophe of the 21st century. And nowhere has COVID been more catastrophic than in New York, which emerged early on as ground zero for the global pandemic. The healthcare providers in New York, which were hit the earliest and hardest by COVID, have dire concerns about the glacial pace of FEMA's reimbursement. Hospitals in New York are bleeding, and instead of treating it as an emergency, it feels to us like FEMA is moving bureaucratically as though it were business as usual. On February 17, 2022, the whole New York delegation, Democrats and Republicans, sent a bipartisan letter calling for a rapid distribution of FEMA public assistance program funds. How much longer must we wait to receive the funds we need to fully recover from COVID?
Congressman, I certainly appreciate your question, and I remember very clearly and vividly my time responding and working with the hospitals in New York City as we were trying to get our heads wrapped around what it was going to take to combat COVID-19. We are working very closely. My regional office, Region 2 office, is working very closely with health and hospitals and the other hospitals, nonprofit hospitals in the New York City area to help advance funding. One of the things that we can do is we don't have to wait for the entire project to have all of the data so we can reimburse it in its entirety. We can reimburse it apportionately. And so we have done that with several of the hospitals. If there are specific hospitals that are still having difficulty, I'd be happy to get that specific information. But we are working very closely with them. As they have information that we can submit, then we would obligate that money for them.
During COVID, we saw our healthcare heroes put their lives at risk during the peak of the pandemic so that everyone else could safely shelter in place. And many hospitals in New York provided our healthcare heroes with hazard pay, not out of preference, but out of necessity for workforce retention in a moment of crisis. Do you believe, as I do, that hazard pay for our healthcare heroes was a critical component of the response to COVID-19?
I do believe that we had to use creative funding sources to make sure that we were getting the qualified staff to come in and support these critical needs in these hospitals. I'm unfamiliar with an increase in hazard pay, as I know we were using contract resources also from.
But you recognize that hazard pay could be a critical tool for sustaining and retaining a workforce that's in danger of burning out and turning over in a global pandemic.
I do believe hazard pay could be used as a critical tool.
And was in fact used, right? It's not theoretical. It was in fact used during COVID. FEMA's policy is as follows with respect to hazard pay. Quote, FEMA cannot reimburse the hazardous retention bonuses because the applicant did not have a pre-disaster labor policy for hazardous duty retention bonuses, meaning the justification for paying the bonuses was not adequately documented. And I have two responses. First, the justification was adequately documented. It was COVID-19. But second, expecting applicants to have a pre-existing policy is nonsensical because the hazard pay was itself an emergency response to COVID. Like whether there was a pre-existing policy should be irrelevant. What should matter is whether the hazard pay was necessitated by the response to COVID.
Congressman, I know that we have existing policies that talk about, having pre-existing policies at local jurisdictions for overtime. I am not familiar specifically with what you are talking about in our response to hazard pay. I'm certainly happy to go take a look at that and see if there's any flexibility within our policy to address that.
I hope you can rethink the requirement for a pre-disaster policy because we're denying our healthcare heroes the hazard pay they deserve. I have a question about Puerto Rico. One would think in the 21st century, every person in every place in America would have reliable electricity. But the reality is different and much darker in Puerto Rico, which has seen a never-ending cycle of power failures. What role is FEMA going to play in expediting the rebuilding of Puerto Rico's electric grid, which is nothing short of an emergency?
Yeah, Congressman, we have a large team that we have put in place in Puerto Rico, working very closely with PREPA and the Puerto Rican government as they are rebuilding from Hurricane Maria. We are working hand in hand with them as they have projects to help them, again, expedite some of the payments to get things moving faster, but also working with them on these longer-term, complicated projects that just take time to finish and complete. But I have a large team over there that is working hand in hand, and we have continuous engagement with the Puerto Rico governor as well as the staff there to ensure that we are meeting their needs.
My time has expired.
The gentleman's time has expired. Administrator Criswell, that concludes our first round of questions. We do have time for a second round of questions. Members who are interested in participating, still please remain in the hearing room or turn your cameras on. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Administrator, you said a minute ago that what we need to do as a nation is to really focus on the threats that we will face in the next 5 to 10 years. I could not agree with you more. We know that climate change is all around us. We focus a bit on that, but I'm reminded of the unbelievable tornadoes in North Florida, the unbelievable flooding in South Florida. Please discuss the ways that FEMA is investing in order to mitigate activities to prepare for the acute threats brought on by climate change.
Yeah, I think the future that FEMA needs to play here and the role that we need to play is to really emphasize our participation and our expertise in increasing individual preparedness, but also reducing the impacts of disasters through our mitigation programs. Many individuals see FEMA as a response and recovery agency, and my goal by the end of my tenure is to make sure that they also recognize our role in being a resilience agency, increasing individual resilience and community resilience. Our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program is our landmark program that's really bringing in more money than we have ever been able to invest in communities, and our focus is to work with communities to help them take a system-based approach, a community-wide approach instead of an incremental approach, so we can have greater impact to protect more parts of these communities.
You know, in addition to acknowledging as a body that climate change is real, how can Congress assist you in your efforts or your short-term and long-term plan over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, Chairwoman Demings, I always appreciate the support that Congress gives us in funding our mitigation programs year after year. And as we have additional needs, we would look forward to working with Congress to make sure that we're really being able to build resilient communities across this nation.
Thank you so much for that. We've already shared a couple of success stories regarding the nonprofit security grant program. But you know what we found out is that many organizations, whether they're places of worship or colleges and universities, just are not aware, communities are not aware of the program in the first place. What steps has FEMA taken to make sure that communities are aware of the nonprofit security grant programs and other similar funding that is available?
Yeah, Chairwoman, a really important question, because if we have funding available but nobody knows about it, then we're not doing our due diligence and making sure that we're increasing resiliency across the nation. I would say we do this in a couple of ways. One, we have increased our amount of stakeholder engagement and outreach through our resilience programs, through our grant programs, doing engagement through our regional administrators, but also our Office of Faith-Based and Community Services, right? They have done an extensive amount of outreach to help people understand ahead of time that this grant program is going to be available and that they can start to prepare now for that grant program. We've also increased and gave additional points to organizations that have never applied before. So we want to give an incentive to nonprofit organizations that have not asked for this funding or received this funding and give them additional points so it encourages more organizations to seek out this program and apply for assistance.
Administrator, as you know, I am proud to co-sponsor the FEMA Equity Act along with Chairman Thompson. And you spoke earlier about just some of the structural issues that result in inequities as it pertains to disaster response. Can you discuss the importance of these actions based on your work to increase equity in FEMA?
Yeah, I would really like to highlight a couple of our programs with our within our individual assistance program. I mentioned a little bit in my opening remarks. We are really committed to increasing I would say reducing the barriers that individuals and communities have to accessing our programs. And we were able to make some simple policy changes last year to increase our equitable delivery. And those changes that I mentioned in my opening remarks about changing the types of documentation we accept allowed 42,000 homeowners and over 53,000 renters receive assistance from FEMA that just a year before we would have denied assistance. I think that the total amount was about $350 million. This is really substantial of understanding the barriers that individuals and communities have to receiving our assistance, really taking the time to understand it, and then looking at why our policy is creating that barrier and what can we do to change that policy. We're continuing to look at our policies, but we're also looking at future legislative or rulemaking changes that we can do for long-term changes to help ensure that those that need our help the most can access it.
Thank you so much, Administrator. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes. Ms. Jackson Lee? Okay, let me just make sure there are no other members who are prepared to ask questions during the second round. Ms. Jackson Lee?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You're recognized for
All right,
5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Administrator, let me quickly just go back to the question I originally asked and just a quick response to the decrease to the State Homeland Security Grant Program and to the Urban Area Security Initiative Program. Do you know why that was proposed as a decrease?
Yes, ma'am. So again, our Homeland Security suite of Homeland Security grants are an essential part of increasing capacity across the country. We have slightly decreased the amount of funding that's within the UASC and the State Homeland Security Grant Program, but at the same time, we have added in new grants such as our Cybersecurity Grant Program and increased the funding within our Nonprofit Security Grant Program. We feel that this is a good balance to build capacity in areas where we don't have capability yet, while sustaining the capacity that we have already built across the country with our other two programs.
So let me then follow up on the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. I would like to work with the Budget Committee and work with the budget going forward to see how we can balance that. I believe it is a very important priority for this committee and for me, dealing with the nonprofit security grant programs, particularly after recent threats to houses of worship and HBCUs. And you're requesting 360 million. I assume that's a plus up, an increase of 110 million. So can you elaborate on the importance of this program? And are there more that FEMA department can do to support these particular programs?
Congresswoman Jackson. Yes, Congresswoman.
Yes,
as Secretary Mayorkas, he has really called for this significant increase that we're seeing in this grant program because of the rise in the types of threats that we're seeing to nonprofit organizations across the country, in particular the houses of worship, as well as our HBCUs. This is an incredible program, again, to build capacity in an area that we just have not invested funding in, and something that our Homeland Security Grant and our UASC program has not addressed. And so we want to continue to use this nonprofit security grant program to build this capability in an area that does not have the same capacity that we're seeing in other parts of our emergency management enterprise.
Well, I think the administration has very good intentions. I would like to find a way to support the nonprofit security grant program and still keep some of these important programs that I mentioned that did lose dollars that are so very important to local areas in the midst of disasters. I also want to put forward my FEMA restructuring bill that I look forward, Administrator, to discussing with the administration in strengthening FEMA's infrastructure personnel. I think we already discussed it, and I clearly want to provide the sort of a support system that FEMA staffing needs. Would you just, again, for the record, restate the importance of ensuring the mental well-being, the financial resources, the payments, and the sensitivity to FEMA employees having to move around, leaving their home most times to address disasters?
Congresswoman Jackson Lee, I appreciate your ongoing support and commitment to our workforce. Again, we can't do what we do without them, and they are incredible servants of the public. As I stated earlier, we are taking a look at how we can better structure our workforce to respond to this increase in the demand of natural disasters that we're experiencing. And my team is continuing to provide technical drafting assistance to you for the bill that you have put forward.
I wanted to emphasize particularly the mental health. I've seen them work in very stressful moments. Is some of the funding working to ensure their well-being as it relates to mental health, dealing with disasters and the terrible impact of disasters?
Yes, ma'am. The mental health of our workforce is an incredible priority for me, and we've put a number of programs in place to make sure that we are very focused on supporting the mental health of our workforce. And part of our budget request will continue to support and expand the type of assistance that we're able to provide.
Thank you. I look forward to really discussing the legislation that I have, and I thank the chairwoman for yielding and her leadership and the ranking member. Thank you all so very much.
The gentlewoman yields back. With that, Administrator Criswell, I thank you for your valuable testimony, and I thank the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witness, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds members that the committee record will remain open for 10 business days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you, Chairwoman.